One of the key aspects of Wilson's 14 points was to allow nations the ability to protect their national interests through the creation of nation-states based on the idea of ethnic self-determination. If you remember our discussion of the Congress of Vienna, the leaders at that conference had the opportunity to redraw the map of Europe, but for the most part they wanted to see nation-states based on national identity. France for the French, Spain for the Spanish. The reason many people support the idea of national self-determination is because nations can feel more secure when they have recognized boundaries and a government that's based on their ideological values. Remember the example of Israel that we discussed in the first video? By bringing people together, they can embrace their national identity and achieve their national goals together. Of course, the danger is that by separating ourselves into nationalist groups, we can develop ultra-nationalist tendencies, but we're going to look at that in the next unit. Often nations will seek self-determination when they feel marginalized. When nations seek independence, they feel it's in their collective interest to make their own decisions about what would benefit them. They want to be able to decide their own self-interest and take responsibility for achieving their own goals. And self-determination doesn't always have to be full independence. It can include a power-sharing agreement. Sometimes we call that asymmetrical federalism or sovereignty association. This type of relationship exists in Great Britain, which is given a high level of autonomy or independence to Scotland. Another way to approach self-determination is decolonization, where the outside rulers are removed, which happened for many countries in Africa a half-century ago. In this unit, we're going to look at two groups in Canada who felt this way and are seeking self-determination, the Quebecois and Aboriginal groups. But for today, let's look at some examples outside of Canada. India is an example of a nation who sought independence from a colonial power, Great Britain. It was the British East India Trading Company that first started to gain control over various regions by being an economic powerhouse. But by 1757, the British military started to control some of the region. Think about that. 2 years later, they conquer Quebec City. What a busy bunch of people. And by 1858, India was officially under the control of the British. While the British brought many advantages to the Indian subcontinent, such as railways and improved education, there were also many problems. Much like our treatment of First Nations groups in Canada, the British government felt that it was in the best interest of the Indian people to be assimilated into British culture. However, this paternalistic governance did change over time as British rulers realized the Indian cultural groups were not willing to change their traditions and customs. While there were some rebellions against British rule, overall, the British military crushed them. By the early 1900s, reform groups were forming around the country, and they argued that they couldn't defeat the British militarily, but they could look for other ways in order to achieve self-determination. One of the more famous leaders of the Indian nationalist movement is Mohandas Gandhi. He argued that the British depended on the cooperation of the Indian people, so if they'd stop cooperating, it would weaken the colonial control. For example, he encouraged people to stop buying the cloth that was imported from Britain and instead weave your own. Through acts of civil disobedience, where you peacefully break a law you disagree with, the nationalist movement gained power. In 1930, Gandhi led a group of people to the sea to gather salt, which, believe it or not, was illegal because then the government couldn't tax it. Gandhi was arrested for gathering salt, and marchers who did the same thing a few months later were actually beaten by the police for doing it. This event gained international attention and started the wheels of independence turning because of pressures both within India and from the global community. Now, it took another decade for independence talks to really get going, but eventually Britain agreed to give India its independence in 1947. As part of the agreement, the nation-state of Pakistan was created for the Muslim residents, while the nation-state of India remained primarily for Hindu people. Later, the nation-state of Bangladesh was formed in the eastern part of Pakistan. Unfortunately, while Gandhi continued to preach the ideas of nonviolence, the nationalist tensions between the two religious groups often turned violent, with Gandhi being assassinated by a Hindu extremist who felt that he was being too accepting of Muslim people. And India and Pakistan have had several wars, often over territorial conflicts. So while these national groups gained sovereignty to protect their national interests, that didn't mean a permanently more peaceful world because those national interests would sometimes clash. This leads me to an important term, Balkanization. We've talked quite a bit about the Balkan Peninsula, that powder keg of Europe. This term was coined in reference to the breakup of the region into smaller and often hostile states. Before World War I, the Ottoman Empire had lost control of much of the region, creating smaller states like Serbia and Bosnia, and hopefully you know how that turned out in 1914. After World War I, based on the idea of self-determination, the nation-state of Yugoslavia was created for the Slavic people. And under the communist dictator Marshal Tito, the nation-state is held together. One reason for this is because under his rule, Tito discouraged the expression of national identities. He did not want his people to identify with their ethnic or cultural differences, but instead stay unified under the idea of being Yugoslavian. However, when he died, leaders such as Slobodan Milosevic encouraged ethnic nationalism to increase, and this led to the violent ethnic conflicts that broke the country into several pieces. Now, we're going to go into a lot more detail on the ultra-nationalistic events that occurred in the 1990s, but I just wanted to share a little note here about a woman I worked with in the 90s as the war was going on. She was a Bosnian and her husband was Serbian, but under Tito, it didn't matter. They loved each other and their families got along. She'd already moved to Canada by the time the war broke out, but she was so sad to see her own family members grow to hate their in-laws just because they were a different ethnicity. There's an interesting point made in social textbooks about how our modern technology can create balkanization. Often when we're searching for information on the internet, we'll seek out the information that we agree with and reject the information we don't like. This can also happen with the media news resources we trust. For example, do you watch CBC News or Fox News? Both of them have a bias. And because of the ease and anonymity of the internet, it can encourage us to attack those who oppose us without seeking to have an understanding of opposing viewpoints. Why do you think I turned the comments off for these videos? You should have seen the hateful and extreme comments that were posted before I turned them off. The last thing I want to summarize is the decolonization of Africa. In Social 10, you looked at the scramble for Africa as European powers sought in their national interests to gain control of regions for economic, social, and political reasons. But colonial control around the globe was decreasing after World Wars I and II because of the international support for self-determination. In some African countries, this move towards independence was quite successful, but unfortunately, in many African countries, the move towards greater sovereignty led to corruption and greater hardships for the members of the nation-state. I think an entry on Wikipedia summed it up nicely. Critics say that the process of African decolonization from the 1950s to the 1970s turned what were relatively well-ordered and peaceful territories administered by the efficient bureaucracies and legal traditions of the Western European empires into violent, inefficient, and corrupt socialist dictatorships, or right-wing family dictatorships with little regard for international rule of law and human rights, and riddled with civil turf wars, barbaric political purges, mass refugee crises, famines, and ethnic conflict. Many of the European colonial powers saw the people in their colonies as childlike and not able to govern themselves. Paternalism, anyone? So when these newly independent nation states did become corrupt, the Europeans said, "See, we told you so." But that's not really fair. We need to remember that the corrupt rule of the colonial powers set the stage. The indigenous people saw how the European governments would bend the rules, discriminate against minorities, and ensure that their people were given privileges and power. So why wouldn't the new leaders ensure that the members of their national group were given privileges while minority groups are discriminated against? Now, don't get me wrong here. I am not excusing the acts of dictators such as Robert Mugabe or Idi Amin. But I want students to understand that the terrible conditions that exist in Africa today are not because the African people are somehow inept and unable to govern themselves the way Europeans are able to. Instead, they're historical, economic, and current political influences that have created a serious mess on this continent. We're going to be exploring more of self-determination in class. We're going to look at issues such as why a minority ethnic group should be allowed to break up an entire country, and yet on the other hand, seeing the need for self-determination to protect minority groups.